Hello and welcome everyone. Welcome to the Field Museum's Connecting Chicago's Legacy Hula to the TEACH Act. My name is Ria Predikin, she, her, Sha. I'm a learning resources educator with the Cyrus Tong Foundation. And I'm here joined with Sam.
Hi, so I am Samantha Shaplow, and I am the school partnership educator, also working on the Cyrus Tong Foundation programming.
And I do want to mention that the Cyrus Tong Foundation has awarded the Field Museum a 3-year grant to develop a suite of kindergarten through 12th grade classroom and virtual lessons on Asian history to fulfill new teaching requirements enacted to help improve public knowledge of Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander NHPI histories and cultures to build cultural empathy and combat racism. And Sam and I recently joined in January, and this will be the first of many offerings we plan to host over the next 3 years. So thank you all for joining us today. Want to go over our agenda for our time together here. We will start with some opening moves. We'll go over briefly what is the TEACH Act, go over some acronyms, some histories and tensions around those acronyms, pedagogical approaches, and discuss the Chicago's Legacy Hula in a mini panel with Ryan and Lonnie, and we will have our closing moves and resources that we will be sure to share with you all. Okay, I see some people saying access. Okay. All right. We want to go over the session objectives for today. That is to learn about the origins, purpose, and significance of the TEACH Act, explore the history and tensions of various acronyms for discussing Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander community history. Want to gain an understanding of how you can include Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander stories when implementing the TEACH Act, and discover Field Museum and community organization resources that are available for teaching about AA and HPI community history. The museum recognizes that the region we now call Chicago was the traditional homelands of many indigenous nations and remains home to diverse Native people today. The land we walk was and remains native land. We are all on native land. We also want to recognize the Cyrus Tong Foundation, who has made this offering possible. Also, we want to thank the support of the Aloha Center Chicago and the Asian American Education Project. Today, we will be joined by Ryan Schussler, exhibition developer here at the Field Museum. Ryan is a writer, editor, journalist, and humanities professional working at the intersection of storytelling, identity, history, current events, and more. For nearly a decade, he has made a career out of helping people tell their own stories and find their voice. This work has taken Ryan across the country and world, but Ryan will always be a proud Midwesterner at heart. We also are joined by Kumu Hula Carol Lani Aloha Lee. Kuma Hula Master Hula teacher Carol Lani Aloha Lee is a native Hawaiian born and raised in the Chicago area, is a musician, advocate, and Kumu teaching hula, ukulele, and appreciation of Native Hawaiian arts and culture. Lani Aloha is the executive director of Aloha Center Chicago and contributed to and helped develop Chicago's Legacy Hula and these lessons. So if you received the email from me for leading up to this event, we asked you to think about what do you remember learning in your K through 12 education about Native Hawaiian history and culture. So we want to give you a few seconds here to think about that. What do you remember learning throughout your grade school education? If you could just silently reflect on that, then we will prompt you for another question in the chat. Okay, and so as you may have noticed already, we're going to be utilizing the chat feature quite often throughout this time together. So hopefully you have access to that. I know that some people may be in the car, totally fine to do that. But we will be adding to the chat here. So if you have access to that, we would like you to type your response in the chat box here, whether formally or informally, from where did you get your ideas about Hawaii? So feel free to drop that in the chat. Okay, I see. Elvis movies, TV, Disney, Johnny Tsunami. Oh, that was a cult favorite. Visiting Hawaii. Family, community, Disney, definitely. Very little social studies. Okay, growing up in Texas, and I did not hear much about Hawaii. Love
We're seeing
both.
a lot of media.
Yeah, definitely.
We see some locals.
Mhm. Great. Thank you for sharing that.
All right, so we're going to switch gears slightly, but I want you to keep all of those responses in mind. We're going to come back to those later. So right now, we are going to look at what exactly the TEACH Act is, and later we're going to examine how and why we are making those connections between the TEACH Act and the Native Hawaiian community history. So what does it mean? So the acronym refers to the teaching of equitable Asian American community history. And it was introduced by State Senator Ram Vilivalam and State Representative Jennifer Gong Gershwitz, and championed by Asian Americans Advancing Justice Chicago and 35 plus other organizations, including the ones you see there to the left. So passed in April 2021, it amended the Illinois School Code, and other states are beginning to follow suit, with Wisconsin being one of the most recent. So what does this act ask? So it went into effect in the 2022-2023 school year, and it applies to all Illinois public elementary and high school students. It requires the teaching of one unit, so very broad, focusing on Asian American history. And this includes the contributions of Asian Americans to the economic, social, and political development of the U.S., the contributions of Asian Americans to advancing civil rights from the 19th century onward, and the history of Asian Americans in Illinois and the Midwest. So what I want you to note is that right now I'm mostly using the term Asian American, but we are going to cover what is unique about the distinct experiences of Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders a little bit later. So why is this important now? So we know what stories we believe are worth telling by what we choose to teach and make visible. Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander communities have been absent mostly from the school curriculum, as many of you indicated. So in everything from film to children's books, representations that do exist often have been stereotypical or limited, particularly to East Asian countries like China and Japan. So the absence of this representation is significant now, particularly in the light of the anti-Asian hate in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic. So launched in March 2020, the Stop AAPI Hate Report has gathered data on this rising anti-Asian hate. Sadly, it's nothing new. So Asian American communities are not a monolith. However, we might speak of Asian American communities as having similar racialized identities. So race is socially constructed and impacts things like access. So those with particular racialized identities, such as Asian Americans, historically have been blocked from immigration, citizenship, naturalization, and equal rights to education. So when we talk about racialized identities, we mean that these groups have shared cultural similarities born out of hardships. So for many Asian American communities, this racialized identity has centered around the prevalence of two interrelated myths. So the perpetual or forever foreigner and model minority myths. So the perpetual foreigner myth has been reflected in legislation using differences in observable traits to justify different policies and laws based on who's considered white and who is not. Asian Americans have been represented either as un-American, exotic, foreign, or unassimilable. And while 19th century Asian immigration boom began in large part in response to labor needs, the sentiment emerged that it was unfair competition with white laborers. Intense backlash came in the form of anti-Asian immigration restrictions and even violence. Labeled as aliens ineligible for citizenship, restrictions on immigration were in place until the Immigration Act of 1965. From the incarceration of Japanese Americans seen as the enemy during World War II, despite any evidence of treason, to being blamed for the COVID pandemic, Asian Americans frequently experience hate as a result of the perpetual foreigner myth. The model minority myth presents an exaggerated sense of Asian American success. Public messages post-World War II focus on the success of Chinese and Japanese Americans as effectively having overcome discrimination. And they were lauded as culturally superior communities with low crime rates and the biological inclination to be hardworking, disciplined, and uncomplaining. The rise of the model minority myth became especially prevalent with the civil rights movement and was used in a deliberate way by the media to place Asian Americans in opposition to other ethnic groups and delegitimize claims and demands by African Americans leading the fight for civil rights. However, what the model minority myth ignores is the vast differences among varying Asian American communities in terms of experience and financial and educational attainment.
The model minority myth denies continued systemic inequities and racism, as well as ignores how Asian Americans were far from quiet in the fight for civil rights, but rather worked in solidarity with other communities of color. So in a moment, we are going to drop a sheet into the chat that has a few acronyms that have been used. I do want to acknowledge the Asian American Education Project that helped facilitate our team's learning around acronyms. There are complex narratives around identity and stereotypes. Often when we think of Asian American, there's a tendency to focus on East Asia. And I want to note that for the purposes of our project on the Tang grant at the Field Museum, we are using AANHPI while also recognizing that Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders are not Asians, and all Pacific Islanders are not Hawaiians. There are limitations to these categories, and we are working within these constraints while also being cautious not to add to the lumping of the communities together. The names that we humans call ourselves and that others call us are politically, culturally, and spiritually meaningful to the development of both individual and group identities, and to activism performed from and through those identities. That is from Lisa Kahaleole Lee. Lonnie can correct me if I pronounced it incorrect. And I also want to know that it's important to disaggregate Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander from Asian American so that the specific needs of Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders are not made invisible. Wanted to give pause here if Lani Aloha, if you wanted to add anything to that.
Yeah, from a personal standpoint, having had no choice, being very young and inserted into this world of more entertainment to the Western world, when for me it was a form of training that we had to keep um, close to our values, aloha values. And every time we would enter into a particular audience of not our choosing, it was difficult to have to re-educate huge audiences before we even get to step out on the stage to present Native Hawaiian. So on the entertainment side, that was really very difficult for me to figure things out as I too was very young, being raised here in Chicago. But today, I think it's very important for me to make sure that educators are out there keeping in mind that the Native Hawaiians, though they are one of the three indigenous peoples recognized by the United States government, Native Hawaiians is the one group of indigenous people who have yet to receive federal recognition. And that is a very special relationship between the Native Hawaiian people and the United States government. So mahalo for making that distinction because our needs are very different.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing.
Mahalo.
I do want to note that there are many acronyms that are utilized. You'll see them in that link there. It's also in your participant agenda. I want to discuss the origins of the term Asian American. The original term Asian American came out of the Pan-Asian student movement of the late 1960s at UC Berkeley as part of an effort to unify what had been disparate Asian American groups into an umbrella that acknowledged a shared identity and rejected the antiquated and geographically subjective term Oriental. It's a political term coined by Emma G. and Yuji Ichioka at UC Berkeley in 1968 for the student organization AAPA, Asian American Political Alliance. It's a community-generated term that emerged out of the civil rights, Black Power, and anti-war movements. It reflected the nascent field of ethnic studies and Third World Liberation Front. So we at the Field Museum are centering the work needs history of Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander communities as we begin this project, proceeding as though the identities, histories, and categorical constructions of Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders are the same actually impedes our understanding of both, and the consequences of those distortions are far more dire for Pacific Islanders who exist as only 3% of the imagined AAPI grouping. The TEAACH Act asks us for educators to make connections to communities in Illinois and the Midwest. And due to the extensive Pacific Island connection at the museum, as well as the existing partnerships with Chicago's Native Hawaiian community, the Field Museum feels uniquely positioned to tell the stories that help elevate the voices that are not always heard in our very own local community, voices that include but are not limited to East Asian communities. We hope to partner with organizations like Aloha Center Chicago, who have already been doing this work to disrupt stereotypes about Hawaii, as Lani Aloha just mentioned, and help others explore the rich history of Native Hawaiians in Chicago specifically. And so in a few moments, hopefully after you hear from Ryan and Lani Aloha, you will be able to glean some ideas for the rich stories of Native Hawaiian history in Chicago that you can share within your own classroom.
Great. So in order to tell these stories, we at the Field Museum's Center for Education and Public Programs have adapted principles and themes more broadly from the field of ethnic studies, particularly the California ethnic studies and liberated ethnic studies models, as well as themes in Asian American studies. So while all Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander community histories are unique and distinct from Asian American history, we hope that you can find some connections between these principles and themes and Native Hawaiian stories as well. So in the Field Museum resources section of your participant agenda, so kind of towards the end, you can certainly look through those at your leisure. You're going to find a link to the educator rubric with the following principles to help you evaluate your own resources and lessons. So resources and experiences should center community narratives. So AANHPI community stories, languages, literacies, and cultural ways of being and learning should be centered meaningfully and critically, encouraging exploration, inquiry, and problem solving. Materials and experiences should reflect not only East Asian communities, but other AANHPI heritages. Communities need to be shown as complex, present, and non-monolithic rather than stereotypical or exotic. And these next two principles are a little bit more museum specific as they relate to museum and community partnerships, but those who are classroom teachers can find connections to your own classroom as well. So when we talk about maintaining community accountability, teachers can make sure that resources are in the voices of AANHPI communities. And teachers may not create official community organization partnerships like we are at the museum, but you can center your lessons around Chicago community history as well as utilize resources created by community organizations. And again, at that resource section of your participant agenda, you're going to see some samples of community resources. Resources and lessons should showcase the value of AANHPI communities and the richness of their languages, cultures, and practices beyond the dominant narrative. Resources and lessons should be critical rather than simply multicultural or diverse, and they should prompt learners to ask questions, engage with critical thinking skills, and question and disrupt systems of power and oppression. Materials and lessons should encourage and provide opportunities for learners to take actions that combat inequity or promote equity and justice within their communities. And other options include engaging in some form of critical cultural production, like creating a mural or an Instagram project addressing a community issue. And finally, as any good teacher would do, lessons should communicate ideas in a variety of ways, as well as offer options for learners to express their learning in different ways, and strive to make lessons and activities experiential and cross-curricular and incorporate the applicable languages of AA and HPI communities, especially for lesson relevant vocabulary. So in addition to our principles for creating resources centered on AA and HPI community history, we at the field are also approaching lessons thematically. So as opposed to simply teaching chronologically, consider how you might center your lessons around pertinent themes in Asian American studies, like the ones here that we've adapted from the Asian American Research Initiative. Again, that is linked in your participant agenda. You'll want to keep these themes in mind as you listen to our guest speakers later and think of how you can connect these themes to Native Hawaiian stories. So you want to begin with individual and community stories. So a look into identity must begin with a look into ourselves and at the unique identities we hold. It is these identities that situate us within society as part of a dominant group or perhaps a marginalized one. However, even in the face of marginalization and discrimination, familial and cultural wealth, community stories can foster resilience, hope, and self-determination. You want to explore representation, stereotypes, and discrimination. So in spite of community diversity, society often represents AA and HPI people in stereotypical ways or neglects to include people outside of East Asian heritage. So you want to introduce students to a variety of communities and delve into stereotypes like the perpetual foreigner and model minority myths, as well as how Pacific Islander communities face different stereotypes. So you want to interrogate the varying reasons Asian and Pacific Islander communities came to and settled in different parts of the United States, as well as the impact of US imperialism in Asia, in Hawaii, and in the Pacific Islands. Critique how the racialization of Asian Americans has presented members of AA and HPI communities from full participation in US society in terms of citizenship and equal access to education. You want to present participation and activism and solidarity. So contrary to the model minority myth that suggests that Asian Americans have remained quiet and have not been involved in the fight for civil rights, they have fought against discriminatory laws, policies, and practices, as well as built cross-racial and cross-ethnic coalitions to fight injustice. Do not be afraid to look at divergence and complicity. So because Asian Americans are not a monolithic entity, disagreements within and between communities about various issues do occur, as has complicitness in things like Asian settler colonialism in Hawaii. So do not be afraid to examine those complexities. So our own edition at the Field Museum is a cross-curricular look at the importance of land and sea. So you want to reflect upon impact and interdependence. Asian Americans have left an indelible mark on the land in the United States, and often it was agricultural needs that drove migration to the United States. However, particularly for Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander communities, it was the sea that provided not only sustenance, but also a sense of identity and the backbone of many cultural practices and spiritual beliefs. Deeply connected to the land and sea, AA and HPI communities have also encountered exploitation of their natural resources and destruction of their cultural heritages due to colonization, particularly from the United States. So see how the 7 pillars of colonization have impacted particularly Pacific Islander communities. And you want to celebrate reclamation and joy. So to counter the absence in historical record in school curriculum, as well as misrepresentation, IA and HPI communities are taking charge of their own stories. They're through language and cultural revitalization programs, historical reenactments, historical sites, I should say, revitalizing ethnic neighborhoods. You want to seek out these efforts and opportunities. Art, music, and dance and other forms of creative expression enable people to both survive as well as challenge oppression. So in creating learning resources and activities, incorporate forms of creative expression for and by AA and HPI communities.
So we will engage in a mini panel with Ryan Schussler and Lani Aloha Lee as our co-creators of the exhibit Chicago's Legacy Hula. And as we listen to the conversation we're about to have here, I invite you to reference the Asian American Studies curriculum framework that Sam just mentioned here, and notice the themes that arise in the stories that you're about to hear, the themes of identity, power and oppression, community and solidarity, reclamation and joy. Just spotlight here. Okay. No. Okay. Can you see Ryan and Lonnie now?
Hello.
Aloha.
Hi. Thank you for joining us. Right. Lonnie, we know you have a long lineage of being Native Hawaiian in Chicago. You're a third generation Native Hawaiian. Could you tell us more about what it means to pass down hula and Native Hawaiian culture to your children and to future generations?
Um, it has, from the very beginning, been only incredibly difficult to continue to deliver our culture as I had received here from my teachers, from my grandmother, from my kumuhula, and then to walk out the doors each and every day and be faced with everyone telling me, well, that's not Hawaiian. This
Mm,
you're supposed to shake like this, or you're supposed to wear cellophane skirts. And um I had not realized for quite a few years how difficult that was going to be to re-educate the public in general about who we were as a people. But early on, I could see signs in very different ways, having been raised. I was born here at the Ravenswood Hospital in the north side
mm,
of Chicago. It's no longer there. And that was really the beginning of where my personal path began for only a few years. And by 69, my mom was able to find a new home for us. And so I was raised out in the northwest suburbs. And back in 69, that was still a very different um, community of people
mm,
who had been there for
mhm,
for us, and they were settled as well. But I never really understood um, the community in a diverse way because this particular community was still very new and was growing. Um, and then through the whole entire process of going through K through 12 and primarily more K through 6 and then 7 and 8. So my classes were divided by the age levels, and it was impossible. It was impossible to even share the right answer when asked by my history teachers or social study
mm,
teachers, and I answer correctly, and they're forcing me, I'm feeling coerced to have to answer incorrectly because I felt later on, it made them feel a little bit more comfortable because that's very uncomfortable
mm, mhm,
to have to address that. Um, and and equally so I was, but all I knew was who I was.
mhm.
I had that right, and I received that right, and never has she failed me, those lessons
Yeah,
of
definitely.
storytelling. And the storytelling, it wasn't like you had shared before. It's not, we have to take great care in the selection of the stories that we're going to
Mhm,
choose. And it's really
absolutely.
super important that each of them have some kind of lineal connection, either to Hawaii or to the people or to the people within your own community. And that if there is something on the inside in the path of the teacher's own experiences, to use that as a gauge,
Mhm,
because I know that everybody has a story. That if they're not thinking Hawaiian, they're going to overlook that they have those stories, but are not accustomed to categorizing maybe some of those stories, grouping them into um, the core values of Hawaiiana, like the Ole Aloha tells us,
mhm,
Akahai e na Hawaii, Lo kahia kulike, olu olu kamana o ha'a ha'a ko kulana, aho nui alana kila. If you just take the first word of each of those lines, teachers, you will be busy for the next few years because each one of them could send you down a whole different life that you've experienced. And by sharing some of yours, and when you share it, don't use pala pala. It's not about exactness. The kids are the most forgiving students we could ever be afforded. So not to worry about that kind. But when you share openly and let the emotions and feelings come forward as they remember that impacted them
Yeah, I
growing.
appreciate that. I appreciate
Yeah.
the letting them uh know that it's not about making a perfect one-to-one exact translation, and learning that from you as well. And I appreciate you sharing about your K through 12 experience. And that sounds like it was really frustrating
Yeah.
to have to make your teachers comfortable, right? Um, so thank you for sharing that. This question is for both Brian and you, Lonnie Aloha. In co-curating the exhibit, Chicago's Legacy Hula, what stories did you want to prioritize in telling the story?
All right, I'll take that one first. So, when we approached Lani and invited her to work with us on this exhibit, we had talked about first and foremost honoring the four Kumuhula, the four hula teachers and practitioners that had perpetuated hula in Chicago and given her, the hula to carry on. Um, and their names, Caroline Namahoe, Pat Kanaha, Bill Sharman, and Ed Kalihiki, are featured prominently in the exhibition. The entire exhibition is structured around them and their lives and who they were and how they came to Chicago. But what was really exciting was that kind of just like that, as soon as we started scratching the surface of archives and databases and libraries, we learned that there was such a deep history of Native Hawaiians coming to Chicago for 130 years, more than 130 years. And so, developing this exhibition, in many ways became an exercise of creating the first archive of this community's history in Chicago. Nothing like it had ever been assembled before. And, I think what's really special in thinking about how to talk about Hawaii in the classroom and how to teach the history of Hawaii in the classroom, I learned that you can tell that entire story from the Kumalipo, from the origins to the king, to the overthrow, to contemporary issues, all through the perspectives of people who lived here in Chicago. Like in every stage of Hawaiian history, we found a family with a connection to an event or a person or a relative that lived in Chicago over the last 130 years.
Wow.
Whether it was from, the family who came to Rogers Park, who were cousins of the Queen and descendants of, the Ali'i, the chiefs and chiefesses of Maui, to the musicians who were at the forefront of musical innovation and the creation of jazz and blues and country music by way of the Hawaiian steel guitar. The inventor of the Hawaiian steel guitar taught on a studio in Wabash Street downtown. Um, I can go on, and I do often go on and on, but just to say that, it's hard to pick what stories to uplift because we found that there were so many that were so ready to be told, and really paint a vibrant picture of Chicago's connections to Hawaii and to Native Hawaiian history and experience. Mani, I don't know if you want to add anything. What was most important to you, to uplift during this project?
Well, it was what motivated me was to tell the story of my four kumuula. It was always about the kumuula here. Excuse me. Because in the process of identifying the four that came to Chicago in the mid 20th century, that is where the legacy began in the means of delivering the expression of our culture, whether it would be in chanting form, in mele, in hula. So I thought when we entered into this, that the beginning of my story was with the kumuhula, but I was wrong.
Mhm.
But I also knew from just growing up and how active the women in our family are in advocating for Native Hawaiian rights. Is it was really about what took place that changed the future path of Native Hawaiians forever. And so what had happened inadvertently is the beginning of my story, which was actually the second wave of Native Hawaiians who arrived to Chicago. Ryan and this crazy awesome team that we had at the Field Museum uncovered that missing part of the untold story, which for me then connected to that hidden story that it began. So what's really important, I think people should know, and teachers out there, it could be a place for you to begin of how would you be sharing that hard talk about the overthrow of the Hawaiian kingdom with each of your age groups that you're engaging with. And I think that the Chicago Legacy Hula had presented that avenue. So if you think about how the Huile Mamo, the very first royal court of expert dancers and musicians and trained in oli and protocols, um, originally gathered and put together by King David Kalakaua. Um, but he would pass away, and then Queen Lili'u would take the throne. And it was the queen who would dispatch this group to Chicago specifically to represent Native Hawaiians at the 1893 Columbian Exposition, the Chicago's World's Fair, the first one. And what had happened in the launching of sending the group up is here we were, we had queen, we had land, we had queen, we had a peoples. And as soon as this troop was sent to Chicago, by the time they landed in Chicago, our queen had been overthrown. And so the moment they stepped foot in Chicago, with all this that would occur and happen and the growth that Ryan just lined up for you, still their paths were so uncertain. This is the group that you see. And the Lundio connection continued on with even members of our Hawaii-based co-curation team, where it was an auntie of her grandmother who was one of the first who came to Chicago. That would be Jenny Wilson. And you see them on the right as well. And this is sort of a sneak peek of how they viewed Hawaii, knowing that they had erected huge, beautiful marble buildings. Hence, the Museum of Science and Industry as we know it today, but that was the first place in which the Field Museum came to be. And this was the space that the entire exposition took place, the Native Hawaiians came to. And you can take this in so many different directions, but hopefully people, teachers, educators out there at large will be able to find a better path than maybe following a book to create how you would choose to deliver, because you have the kids in front of you. You know them better than anyone else. And I never thought that any one single book would be able to accomplish that for any teacher. So, for me, that I can't thank you enough, Ryan, because that part of that story, I believe, is what weighed upon me as I was growing up in the mid 60s. There were so many things people had wrong, and they were so fixed on it. They really believed what they had learned, no matter where the sources were. So I just thought I'd try to connect that. But again, what really helped guided us is, again, Ryan had shared there were lineal connections all over the place. I think the idea of legacy, hula especially, really began now with the four Kumuhula. And if it had not been for them, we would not be having this conversation, I'm pretty sure, today. And whatever anyone had in the means of the perception of hula, it's probably going to be farthest from what it really is. So it is difficult to think about legacy if you do not think about what came before. And in the Hawaiian chronological order of time, what has occurred, history, what has already occurred is actually in front of us. And that what has not yet happened is behind us. We don't know yet, but history remains in front of us, I believe, because it reminds us of the decisions and the actions that had been made, what were the results of them, and to take that into account as we move forward of what not to do.
Absolutely. Yeah, thank you for sharing that. And Lanilo, you kind of mentioned about the Chicago's World's Fair, the 1893 Columbian Exposition. And I know that both of you did so much research. There was so many stories to tell as you were diving into this research. But can you, Ryan, specifically tell us in the research that you found about the first Native Hawaiians and kind of aligning with the Field Museum's first location, and kind of elaborate on that?
Yeah, just to speak more to a little more to what Lonnie shared, that those photos that we were just showing, that was
Yes.
the group, the Royal Hula Troupe and Chorus that was sent to Chicago in 1893. And I think just having gone to public school in the United States myself in the last 30 years, a great place for me to start when I was learning more about Hawaii is that Hawaii was actually a kingdom. It was an independent kingdom with a royal family before it was a territory, before it was a state. And so, whenever I've been giving these presentations, sometimes I have to pause because I say the Queen of Hawaii sent this group to Chicago, but people are still, like, oh, wait, there was a queen. Yeah, we have to start there. There was a queen.
Yes.
And she sent this group to Chicago. And as Lonnie was saying, before they even had gotten off the boat in San Francisco to catch the train to Chicago was when the Queen was overthrown. And they carried on and continued on to Chicago, where an American promoter, had sort of directed their act and pressured them to, present hula in a sort of stereotypical way with the grass skirts, and they wanted them to take their tops off and all these things. And these women resisted all of this. It was resistance to the best that they could. But what was really, sort of compelling was that, the picture in there where it was the two women sitting in grass skirts is kind of the origin of the hula stereotype that so many of us are immersed in. That stereotype started here in Chicago, and it started the genesis of the Field Museum. And so it's not insignificant. And I think it's actually quite powerful that now 130 years later, we're doing the work to start to untangle that, because all of that misperception, all of that led to, the harm and, Lonnie, the experiences you had in the classroom, all of that began in Chicago. And so it's right that we start to pick it apart here too. It's our duty. And just to share more, to get off my soapbox, just to share more about what happened to those women. They performed at the World's Fair. And then, some of them went their separate ways. But Jenny Wilson, who Lonnie mentioned, she went on a world tour. She went to Europe, where she presented hula on behalf of the Queen for the Tsar of Russia, for the Kaiser in Germany, for members of the British royal family. So even though the overthrow had happened, she still kept her mandate from the Queen and represented Native Hawaiians and the Hawaiian Kingdom on the global stage. She came back to Chicago and performed, on the vaudeville circuit for several years. And I'm actually going to share that picture again because there's a really lovely story. In that picture on the top right, where you see the two women sitting in a chair, you'll notice that Jenny on the right has bracelets on her wrist. She gave an interview near the end of her life where the reporter asked why she was still wearing those bracelets, because by then, she was older, her arms had swollen, they were cutting into her skin. And she said that she got them at the World's Fair in Chicago all those years ago and was never going to take them off and wanted to be buried with them on. But they were gifts to her from the Egyptian women who were also presenting Rakshaki, belly dancing at the World's
Mm.
Fair at the pavilion next to the Hawaiian cyclorama. And so there's this really powerful story of these women from different parts of the world who end up in Chicago in the same circumstances, kind of being pressured to put their culture on display, and they find friendship and camaraderie together um, in Chicago, which is a really beautiful story. But anyway, while Jenny was performing in Chicago on the vaudeville circuit, she met another young Native Hawaiian man who was a band promoter. They got married, went back to Honolulu, where he eventually became mayor.
Oh,
And so
wow.
Jenny Wilson, who presented the first recorded hula in the city of Chicago, was the first lady of Honolulu for many years, and also one of the first delegates from Hawaii at the Democratic National Convention many years later as well.
Wow.
That's just one, one story of so many that we
So many
uncovered as part of
connections.
this exhibit. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I want to go back to something that you mentioned earlier, Lani Aloha. You mentioned, how in your K through 12 studies, you didn't really hear about your own history and culture about Native Hawaiians. And I guess, we're here in a room full of educators, um, formally or informally. But if you were to, I guess, go back to your K through 12 teachers, what would you hope they would include in their teaching of Native Hawaiian history and community culture? I know that's a really big question, important. So I just wanted to see if you could go back in time, what would you tell your teachers to begin with?
I would say not to begin with hula because that'd be too easy to go down the same
Mm,
path. Um, Perhaps, well, I know that I would immediately direct people to traditional mo'olelo that had been told and preserved from the old days, because at the same time, if they could allow themselves to embrace those stories, the history of old Hawaii are also embedded in that. And through that, they can learn more about how Hawaiians had vibrant communities, had so much food in in the
mm,
ocean. They were never in fear of you know, disparities like food. Um
mhm,
and the way that they lived their entire lives was always with the future generation in front of them, the decisions they made in that way. So I think that the older Mo'olelo is super important. I'm very delighted with some of the research that you guys have already made in identifying what those resources could be. I am so delighted about that. I think that um, as I had mentioned before, I think just to look at one simple chant like the Ole Aloha, a
mhm.
five-line thing, because embedded in those five lines, beginning with the first words of five really heavy Hawaiian terms, I think those are more useful for teachers to look to that than it is to open up a dictionary. You
Mhm.
know, and there are other avenues about that I think are a better places if they haven't had, you know, a building block or foundation of learning Hawaiian language from the floor up. I'm still sold on Kuakanaka's um the language card system that they have, that they're
Yes.
useful terms day to day, that other terms are useful for the teachers also day to day, but geared towards guiding students and inspiring them and lifting them. And through the use of these, I think that that is the missing part of instilling Hawaiian values in
Mhm, mhm,
kids. So you kind of need to work both sides of that, the mo'olelo as best as you can. And I think that you guys are addressing that to take the research out of their hands and know that they're going to land in a good place with that. And there's ways for them to extrapolate further on some of that material that they're seeing. And again, the Kuakanaka game, the cards that you could use, but
Yeah.
also I think the Hawaiian games, when we're dealing with kids, some of that stuff is boring. You got to get them outside and to identify some games. And I've been looking at that even more closely. I had utilized it, did not even realize it, but as I had developed an ukulele strumming curriculum, power strumming style, I had not realized that as I was developing the kids' ook muscles, that they can't even hold the ook that they're holding, or it weighs as much as the kids do. Um, I had to strengthen their hands. And so I had used the old Hawaiian game of the hooky. But
Mm.
all does it, but they don't realize that that was truly a focused game for strength building all the way up the arms. So those games, I think, also have fun uses for the language. It'll help the kids learn a little bit more about what that time of the year was that the king demanded everyone has to play.
Yes.
The moment they put down the ihe, they put down the spear, no warring. The only work to be done would be the planting for food to feed, your families. But so that would open up another avenue of looking at the entire makahiki season and understanding a little bit more about how, say, the warriors were training. That's
Mm-hmm.
a lot of those were developed for that during this downtime. Um, so I really, those would be the three basic areas. If there's a way you can get your head wrapped around that, I just think teachers will have a really fun time with the kids. The kids will be walking around speaking Hawaiian terms, and the teachers will know how to respond to them properly. And I guess I just gave you my dream.
We're going to try to help make that come to life, right? Um, it, Learning about Olelo, the Hawaiian language, Native Hawaiian language, and making it accessible to teachers and to students, to young people, and finding the fun in learning that in games, and discovering the values, Native Hawaiian values through the chants. Um, so thank you for that. Thanks so much for engaging in this panel and for sharing your stories. I'm going to remove the spotlight. So thank you again for being here. And let me remove my spotlight here. All right, I'm going to share the screen again. Okay, so as Sam mentioned, these themes earlier from the Asian American Studies Curriculum Framework themes. You'll see them here on the screen. We want to have you think about which themes emerged as you heard the stories of Chicago's legacy hula. So in a moment, we want you to we invite you to type your response into the chat, but don't hit submit yet. We're going to engage in a waterfall chat where we all enter at the same time. And so we could see all of the responses together. So type some of the themes that you heard emerging from the screen here from the framework. And we also have that dropped. It's also in your participant agenda. And we want to know what themes you heard emerging from the Chicago's Legacy Hula stories. So let you type that into the chat. Don't hit submit yet. And then on the count of, let's see, I'll give you a few seconds first. You might need to think about which themes you heard there. Okay, so in 3, 2, 1, go ahead and drop the themes you heard.
Whoa.
Nice, a nice waterfall chat there. So I find that, a lot of we get influenced by other people when we see their chat response, right? So we just wanted to hear what you thought you heard from those stories.
So we are getting lots of solidarity, resistance to oppression, identity, land and sea, reclaiming community voices, identity all in caps,
Yes.
activism, solidarity, reclamation, joy, lots of joy. Storytelling and aloha. I like all the letters emphasized there. Identity, again, reclamation, joy, true culture versus perception, inclusivity, identity, cultural respect and response with games. I like that the games are the takeaway. We all like that. Connections of Hula to Chicago. So lots of similar themes there: family, legacy, identity, and storytelling again as well. So lots of those themes popped up for you.
Thank you. Whoops, I forgot I had a slide on that. That's okay. So we we're so excited for all the lessons, the PD offerings that we'll have in the future. As we mentioned, that Sam and I just recently got hired on this 3-year project with the Cyrus Tang Foundation. We do have a lot of resources that are at the end of your participant agenda, ranging from the Field Museum specific resources, as well as AA NHPI organizational resources. We also have an upcoming professional development summer institute for July 2024, July 24 to 25. We have a discount code available for those who need it. That's also there. Sam just dropped the link there in the chat box. And we have the honor of having Lani Aloha as our keynote speaker for day 1, which the theme is Native Hawaiian place-based learning on the principle of Ike Aina. And then the second day will be about fossils and rocks, social emotional learning, rounding walk to Northerly Islands. So we're going to get a nice little walk in there. We want to highlight that it is a 1-year anniversary of Chicago's legacy hula. And on Saturday, May 25th, there will be a performance and a celebration in front of the Maori House. So that is Saturday, May 25th here at the Field Museum. Want to take a moment, as we mentioned, this is our first offering of the 3-year program. We want to hear from you. Thank you for joining us, and we would love to hear your feedback. In our evaluation, we have dropped the link to the evaluation in the chat, but we also have a QR code if that's easier for you to just chat that, snap that with your phone. We'd love to hear what you'd like to see in the future. If this was helpful to you attending this session. And on our evaluation, hopefully you will have that now. We will ask you about our session objectives. So I do want to go back to the session objectives that we had at the beginning. It looks like some people are still doing the QR code, so I just want to make sure. So these were our session objectives that we had at the beginning that we hope to go over in the last 60 minutes. So I'm going to give you a few minutes to fill out that evaluation. We really value your feedback and any insights that you may have to offer us as we continue to plan for the future. And as we continue to plan over the next 3 years, we will focus on centering the needs, stories, and histories of Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders in our AA NHPI work. In the future, we hope to be offering more sessions on the Maori people, the Marshall Islands, and the Chamorro of Guam, just to name a few. You should all have my information already, as well as Sam, who is copied on all those emails. But feel free to email me if you need to ask a specific question. Later this week, we'll send out a follow-up email with all the relevant links for the future. And again, thank you for joining us today. We appreciate you.
Aloha.